About a year ago, I posted a video about a watch box but didn't include any voiceover. This is a very similar build, so I figured I would give some insight into the process. The first step, as always, is to break down my lumber. This is a big piece of 8/4 jatoba or Brazilian cherry. I've decided the miter saw takes up too much space relative to its uses in my shop, so I'm using the circular saw to break things down. From there, I can break things down further at the table saw. This wood is very dense and can really dull your tools. I didn't want to damage my bandsaw blade, so I'm resawing the material at the table saw. I only need 1/2 inch thick material, so waste isn't a huge concern with the 8/4 stock. This glue up is for the top panel. I like to get things in clamps early on, even though I won't need it for a little while. All it takes is 2 little parallel clamps and a couple F clamps to keep things aligned. These are still mostly rough except for the jointed glue surfaces. I then move on to the normal milling process, starting with face joining my material. This gives a flat reference face that I can then plane to thickness. After planing, I put a square edge on one side, then take it to the table saw so I can rip it to width. Then I use my crosscut sled to cut the pieces to their final length. In general, I prefer to use dedicated ripping and crosscut blades for each task. I find the added time of swapping blades is worth the cut quality. The joinery on this box will be finger or box joints. I use the Incra eye box for this task, and I prefer the fingers to be square, so since I have 1/2 inch thick material, I'll use a 1/2 inch dado stack. If I had 3/8 inch material, I will use a 3/8 inch thick dado stack. I make as many test cuts as necessary to dial in the fit. Having extra material of the same species and thickness is helpful for this task. A super hard wood like jatoba doesn't really compress much when you're fitting the joint, so if you were to use a softwood as your test material, you might not get the same fit as you're expecting. From there, I make all of the cuts. One critical thing to remember is using a fresh backer board, which decreases your risk of tear out. I also rip my pieces wider than needed. Once I cut the finger joints, I rip the boards down to the nearest finger so that there are no partial fingers. The next step is to route the grooves for the top and bottom panels. The bottom panel receives 1/4 inch grooves, and what you see here is an 1/8 inch groove for the top panel. I take this in 2 passes so as not to overload the bit. The front and back pieces receive stop grooves, which requires a plunge cut. Router bits aren't the greatest at plunging straight into material, so I like to slowly oscillate the material as I lower it onto the bit. The bottom panel is a simple floating panel completely housed in the groove. The top panel is a little more complicated. A groove is cut on all 4 sides of the panel so that it can slip into the 1/8 inch groove I just routed. This takes a few test cuts to get right and depends on the spacing of your router fence, table saw fence, router bit diameter, and saw blade thickness. There are a lot of moving parts here. In the end, I use a little block plane to finesse the fit, and what you see here is exactly what I was after. The interior of this box will receive fiber flocking later on, so I decided to pre-finish the inside with a coat of shellac. I taped off any areas that will see glue so as not to affect the glue's adhesion. Speaking of glue, I used liquid hide glue for this glue up. It has a longer open time than PVA glue and also lubricates the joints rather than swelling them. This allowed the relatively tight finger joints to slide shut easily. In all, 8 parallel clamps were needed to get the proper pressure in all directions. I always cut the fingers so that they end up about a 1/16 of an inch proud, then I can come back and trim them flush at the router. I have the box propped up on a piece of MDF so that the fingers on the other end don't tilt the box upward. While the box is still in one piece, I do a little bit of sanding up to 150 grit. This makes sure that I don't have to sand any narrow pieces after the lid is cut off. Speaking of cutting off the lid, I then use a table saw to rip the top off. This is always a nerve-wracking process because any tip one way or the other can damage the box. To smooth things out, I built a coffee table prototype to sand on. I've now realized I did not do a great job filming the making of these dividers. I used 1/4 inch thick maple to make a 2x3 grid. The pieces were sanded down at the drum sander to fit the 1/4 inch thick dado perfectly. Last time I made this box, the jatoba wreaked havoc on the little hinge screws. No matter what I did, the brass and steel screws kept getting their heads twisted off. I simply could not thread the jatoba. I tried wax, I tried bigger pilot holes, you name it, I tried it. To combat that, I'm installing some softer dowels that the screws can thread into. This ended up working great and was a huge relief. After using these Brusso hinges a number of times, I decided to get the routing template to make life easier. A guide bushing and 1/4 inch router bit takes care of most of the mortise, while a chisel cleans up the corners. Then I can route the mortise for the brass latch. This requires careful setup so that the lid and base are aligned properly. On light routing like this, I prefer to hold the router closer to the base to mitigate any chance of the router tipping. I take this mortise in 2 passes and it usually gives me a perfect fit. Some final prep is required, which includes some chamfers, sanding, and adding my brand. Areas on the lid couldn't be reliably reached with the router, so I used a block plane to chamfer those by hand. I decided to use 2 coats of walnut oil as well as a coat of walnut oil and wax mixture to finish this box. The walnut oil is a relatively light duty finish but is easy to touch up and leaves a close to the wood feel. And now to my least favorite part of this build, the fiber flocking. There are very few options to adding a soft touch interior on a wooden box like this. This process is two parts, the colored adhesive and the colored fibers. Before starting, I sift the fibers because they tend to ball up in the humid South Florida weather. I then add a generous coat of the adhesive. The shellac I added earlier prevents this adhesive from being completely absorbed by the wood. From there, I use the included tube to shoot the flocking on every surface. The one tip I have is to apply way more fiber than you think is necessary. There's no penalty for adding too much because you can always collect the stuff that doesn't adhere. After this shot here, I refilled the tube and added even more fiber. The base had much more surface area to deal with the dividers installed, but went well enough and gave me pretty good results. Finally, I can attach the hinges and the latch. I use a very small amount of 5-minute epoxy for the latch. Before installing it, I scuffed up the underside to promote better adhesion between the brass and the wood. And that's about it. If you have any questions, please leave them in the comments below. If you would like to see projects like this while they're being made, follow me on Instagram at parillaworks. Until next time, thanks for watching.